Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. You guys wanted to know why democracy failed in Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. So that's what we're going to tackle today.
Sounds good.
Yeah. It's a big one. I mean, I think the 1990s in Russia were a pretty crazy time. So much change happening so fast.
Yeah, and all the sources we've got point to just how tough that transition was, politically, economically, everything.
Exactly. We've got articles here about the challenges of moving to a market economy and kind of what went down in Russia in the 90s. Like, it's not just history, it's relevant to what's going on today too.
Definitely. I mean, understanding what happened there could help us understand just how fragile democracy can be anywhere.
Right. And, maybe even help us spot warning signs for authoritarianism.
Absolutely. The sources we're looking at really dig into all of that.
So should we just jump right in?
Let's do it.
Okay. So first off, when we talk about Russia in the 90s, we got to remember this is a nation rebuilding itself from scratch.
Right. The whole political system, the economic system, gone. Like trying to build something totally new from the ground up.
And it wasn't exactly a smooth process, right?
No, not at all. One article talks about the shock therapy approach. They tried to jolt the economy towards a market system.
Shock therapy. What does that even mean?
Well, it was basically this idea that rapid privatization and deregulation would shock the system into being more efficient.
Yeah.
Get rid of all the old Soviet style stuff overnight.
And how'd that work out?
Honestly, it was kind of a disaster.
Yeah. The articles paint a pretty grim picture.
Mm.
I mean, imagine you're just an average person in Russia. Your life savings are suddenly worthless because of crazy inflation.
Yeah, and on top of that, your job disappears because state-run industries are being sold off to private companies left and right.
So basically chaos.
Pretty much. The sources talk about unpaid wages, skyrocketing poverty, even a drop in life expectancy. It was rough.
No wonder people started connecting democracy with suffering and instability.
Exactly. For a lot of people, democracy became synonymous with things getting worse.
And it wasn't just the economic stuff either. There was organized crime corruption, a feeling that things were out of control.
Oh, yeah. There's this one article about Yeltsin shelling the parliament building in '93. Talk about a dramatic start for a brand new democracy.
Wow. Okay, so, did democracy fail Russia, or did Russia fail democracy? What do you think?
It's a tough question. What conditions do you need for a democracy to actually work?
Yeah, it can't just be about voting.
Definitely not.
Huh.
One article said that democracy is like a culture, a set of habits and values you have to build over time.
So maybe Russia just wasn't ready for it.
Well, it's complicated. But the sources do point out that Russia didn't really have a strong civic culture, after decades under Soviet rule.
Right, people weren't used to participating in government or holding their leaders accountable.
Exactly. It was like trying to build a house without a foundation.
But even established democracies struggle with civic engagement, right? I mean, you see voter apathy everywhere these days.
That's true. It's like democracy is a muscle you have to keep exercising.
So what does that mean for countries trying to transition from authoritarian rule? Sounds like a catch-22.
That's a great point. And it leads to another big question. How do you even teach democracy, especially when people associate it with bad times?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
How do you convince people that something that seems to have made their lives worse is actually good for them?
Right. One article had some interesting ideas about how to make democracy stronger, though. What if we actually focused on teaching it in schools, not just theoretically, but giving kids real experience with democratic decision-making?
So student government, but with actual power.
Exactly. And then there's this idea of participatory budgeting, where citizens get to decide how some of their tax money is spent.
That sounds cool. It would give people a direct stake in their community.
Right. And it could make them way more invested in local politics.
Okay, what else?
Well, the article also talked about community assemblies and citizen juries.
What are those?
Basically, they're groups of randomly selected people who get to help make decisions on specific policies.
Interesting. So jury duty, but for shaping your town or city.
Exactly. It's all about getting people engaged and involved instead of just letting politicians decide everything.
And would this actually work? I mean, would people really want to do all this extra stuff?
It's hard to say, but the article argues that when people feel like they have a real voice, they're more likely to be invested in the system even if it's not perfect.
I guess it makes sense. So what do you think? Are there any specific examples of this working in other countries?
Yeah, actually there are. The article mentions a few cases where participatory budgeting has been really successful in cities in Brazil and in the US, actually.
Wow, I had no idea. That's really cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see how that could make people feel more connected to their community.
Exactly. And it can also lead to more equitable outcomes because people from all walks of life get to have a say in how resources are allocated.
So it's not just about making democracy stronger, it's about making it fairer too.
Precisely. And the article also emphasizes the importance of media literacy and critical thinking skills.
Especially these days with all the fake news and misinformation flying around.
Exactly. People need to be able to separate fact from fiction and to think for themselves.
No matter where they live.
Absolutely. And finally, the article suggests more direct engagement with politicians, whether through town hall meetings or online platforms.
So basically making sure the politicians are actually listening to the people they represent.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of accountability where citizens feel empowered to question their leaders and hold them responsible.
So all of this sounds great in theory, but couldn't it have actually prevented what happened in Russia? Like, were there deeper issues at play?
That's the million-dollar question. One could argue that Russia was in such a state of crisis after the Soviet collapse that any attempt at democracy was doomed to fail. But the articles also suggest that the way the transition was handled, the shock therapy, the rampant corruption, the weak institutions created a perfect storm that made democracy seem like a recipe for disaster in the eyes of many Russians.
So it's kind of the experiment itself tainted the very idea of democracy for a whole generation.
It's possible, and that brings us to another important factor, the historical context. Like, Russia has a long history of strong centralized rule from the czars to the Soviet era. So the idea of a democratic system with its focus on individual rights and limited government might have felt completely alien to many Russians.
So are we saying that culture trumps everything? That history dictates destiny?
Not necessarily, but it's clear that cultural and historical factors have a huge influence. One article compares Russia's experience to other post-communist states like Poland or the Baltic countries, which have transitioned to democracy more successfully.
Interesting. So what were the differences in those countries?
For one, they had a stronger pre-communist tradition of democratic institutions and civic engagement. Like Poland, for instance, had a long history of parliamentary democracy before the Soviet era. And the Baltic states, although they were forced into the Soviet Union, had a strong sense of national identity and a burning desire to break free from Russian control.
So they had a clearer vision of what they were aiming for.
Yeah.
A sense of purpose that wasn't just about escaping communism.
Exactly. And they also received considerable support from the West in the form of economic aid and political guidance. Russia, on the other hand, was viewed more as a threat by the West, especially after Putin came to power and started asserting Russia's place on the world stage.
Right, so geopolitical factors definitely play a role too. Democracy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by a complex web of international relations and power dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. And Russia's story is a reminder that transitioning to democracy is a long and difficult process with no guaranteed success. It requires not just free and fair elections, but also a vibrant civil society, independent media, and a culture of accountability.
And maybe a bit of luck too in terms of timing international support and even the personalities involved.
Perhaps. But one thing's for sure, democracy is fragile. It needs constant care and attention.
So what lessons can we take away from Russia's experience? And how can we apply them to the world today?
One article talks about the danger of equating democracy with chaos and instability. That played a major role in Putin's rise to power. He exploited people's fear of disorder and their desire for a strong leader who could bring back stability and national pride.
We're seeing similar trends in other parts of the world where populist leaders are capitalizing on people's anxieties and frustrations with the status quo. They offer simple solutions to complex problems, often at the expense of democratic norms and institutions.
It's a tempting message, especially during times of economic hardship or political unrest. People are more likely to turn to authoritarianism when they feel like democracy has failed them.
So what's the answer? How do we prevent democracy from failing in other places?
The articles really stress that a strong civic culture is key. People need to be actively involved in their communities, well-informed about the issues, and ready to hold their leaders accountable.
It's like we need to rediscover what it means to be a citizen. Not just a legal status, but an active participant in shaping our society.
Exactly. And that requires education not just in schools, but in the wider community as well. People need to understand how democracy works, why it's so vital, and how they can make a difference.
So it's not enough to just teach people how to vote. We need to teach them how to be active, engaged citizens.
Exactly. And that includes things like media literacy, critical thinking skills, and the ability to have respectful, productive conversations with people who hold different views.
Because let's face it, democracy is messy. It's about debate, compromise, and finding common ground even when we disagree.
And it's about recognizing that democracy is a journey, not a destination. It's an ongoing process of experimenting, adapting, and learning from our mistakes.
So maybe Russia's story isn't just a cautionary tale. Maybe it's also a reminder that democracy is always a work in progress.
And that we all have a role to play in protecting and strengthening it no matter where we live.
That's a powerful thought to keep in mind. It reminds us that while a strong leader can sometimes bring stability, concentrating power in one person or group carries its own risks.
Exactly. Think back to those 6 ideas for strengthening democracy that we talked about earlier. They all focus on ways to distribute power more evenly throughout society. When people have a genuine voice in the decisions that affect their lives, they're more likely to be invested in the system, even if it's not perfect.
It makes you wonder if those measures could have changed Russia's path. What if everyday Russians had been empowered to participate in local governance, shape their communities through participatory budgeting, and hold their leaders accountable through open forums?
It's impossible to know for sure, of course, but it's a fascinating thought experiment. Perhaps if democracy had been more deeply rooted in Russian society, if people had directly experienced its benefits, they might have been less willing to accept Putin's style of authoritarianism.
As we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listener? What can they learn from Russia's experience?
I think the most important lesson is that democracy isn't a spectator sport. It requires active participation, critical thinking, and a willingness to engage in constructive dialogue even when it's tough.
And it's something we need to constantly work on, both individually and as a society. We can't take democracy for granted. It's precious, fragile, and needs to be nurtured and protected.
Well said. I'll leave the listener with this final thought. Take a moment to reflect on your own role in the democratic process. Are you engaged, informed, willing to stand up for what you believe in? Because at the end of the day, the fate of democracy rests on the shoulders of every citizen.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complexities of Russia's journey. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.
Yeah, it's almost like the experiment itself. It kind of tainted the whole idea of democracy for a generation.
Makes you wonder if there's ever, a good time to switch to democracy, or if it's always going to be this messy.
Right, and we can't forget about the historical context either. I mean, Russia's history is, full of strong centralized rule, czars, Soviet Union. So democracy with individual rights and a limited government, it might have felt totally foreign to a lot of Russians.
So are we saying that culture, overrides everything? That history, decides your destiny?
I don't know about that, but culture and history definitely have a huge impact. One article compared Russia to other post-communist countries, Poland, the Baltic states. They transitioned to democracy more smoothly.
So what was different about them?
Well, for one thing, they had a stronger tradition of democracy even before communism. Poland had parliamentary democracy way back when, and the Baltic states, even though they were part of the Soviet Union, they had this strong national identity, this drive to break free from Russian control.
So they had a clearer goal, something bigger than just getting away from communism.
Exactly. And they got a lot of help from the West, too. Economic aid, political guidance. Russia, on the other hand, was seen as more of a threat by the West, especially after Putin took over and started flexing Russia's muscles.
It's interesting how, global politics plays into all of this. Democracy doesn't exist in a bubble. It's all connected to international relations and power struggles.
Absolutely. And Russia's story shows us that switching to democracy, it's a long, hard road. And there's no guarantee it'll work. You need more than just elections. You need a strong civil society, a free press, a culture of accountability.
And maybe a bit of luck, too. Being in the right place at the right time, having international support, even having the right leaders.
Maybe. But one thing's clear, democracy's fragile. You got to take care of it constantly.
So what lessons can we learn from what happened in Russia? And how do we apply them to what's going on in the world today?
One article talked about how dangerous it is to link democracy with chaos and instability. That's a big part of how Putin came to power. He played on people's fear of disorder, their desire for a strong leader, someone who could bring back stability, national pride.
We're seeing that same kind of thing happening in other countries now, too. Populist leaders taking advantage of people's anxieties, their frustrations with the way things are. They promise easy fixes for complex problems, often by undermining democracy.
It's an appealing message, especially when times are tough. Economic hardship, political turmoil, people are more likely to embrace authoritarianism when they feel like democracy has let them down.
So what can we do about it? How do we stop democracy from failing in other places?
The articles all emphasize how important a strong civic culture is. People need to be involved in their communities, informed about the issues, ready to hold their leaders accountable.
We need to remember what it means to be a citizen. not just having a passport, but actively shaping our society.
Exactly. And that takes education. Not just in schools, but everywhere. People need to understand how democracy works, why it's so important, how they can make a difference.
So it's not just about teaching people to vote, it's about teaching them to be active, engaged citizens.
Exactly. And that includes media literacy, critical thinking, the ability to have respectful, productive conversations with people who disagree with you.
Because democracy is messy, right? It's about debate, compromise, finding common ground, even when you have different opinions.
And it's about knowing that democracy isn't a finish line, it's a journey. It's constantly evolving, adapting, learning from its mistakes.
So maybe Russia's story isn't just a warning. It's a reminder that democracy is always a work in progress.
And that we all have a part to play in making it stronger wherever we are.
It's a powerful thought. And it reminds us that while a strong leader can sometimes bring stability, giving too much power to one person or group that can be dangerous too.
Exactly. Remember those 6 ideas for strengthening democracy? They're all about sharing power more equally throughout society. When people have a real voice in the decisions that affect their lives, they're more likely to be invested in the system, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah, it makes you think like, what if things had been different in Russia? What if people had more say in how their communities were run, more control over their tax money, more ways to hold their leaders accountable?
It's a good question. I mean, it's impossible to know for sure, but it's interesting to imagine. What if democracy had been more ingrained in Russian society? What if people had actually felt the benefits of it firsthand?
Maybe they wouldn't have been so quick to accept Putin's way of doing things.
Possibly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway for our listeners? What can they learn from all of this?
What have we learned?
I think the most important thing to remember is that democracy, it's not a spectator sport. You can't just sit back and watch. You have to participate, think critically, be willing to engage in conversations even when they're difficult.
It's something we all have to work on constantly, both individually and as a society. We can't just assume democracy will always be there. It's precious, it's fragile, it needs to be protected.
Absolutely. And I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Think about your own role in the democratic process. Are you engaged? Are you informed? Are you willing to speak up for what you believe in?
Because in the end, democracy depends on every single one of us.
That's right. It's
Right.
up to all of us to make sure it survives and thrives.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Russia's journey. It's been a fascinating discussion.
It has. And hopefully it's given everyone some food for thought.
Definitely. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep striving for a better world for all of us.